Welcome back to Stories of History. I'm your host, Virgilio, and today we're diving deep into a period you might think you know, Prohibition in the United States, but trust me, there's more to this story than meets the eye. We're going to uncover how a well-intentioned attempt to curb alcohol consumption actually fueled organized crime, sparked a culture of rebellion, and left a lasting impact on American society. Okay, so let's set the stage. It's 19th century America, and the Industrial Revolution is in full swing. But this progress came at a cost. Think worker exploitation, overcrowded slums, and for many, alcohol became a way to cope with the harsh realities of poverty. Religious movements saw alcohol as the root of the problem, pushing for temperance. Now fast forward to the late 19th century. Workers are starting to organize, demanding better conditions. This sparked fear among conservative Americans who saw these labor movements as a threat to their vision of the nation. They clung to the idea of America first, opposing worker rights and anything deemed morally unacceptable. And you guessed, alcohol topped that list. At the same time, temperance movements, many led by women, were gaining momentum. Some were driven by moral convictions, while others saw firsthand the devastating impact of alcohol on families and safety. Imagine coming home to a drunk and potentially violent spouse every day, or struggling to feed your family because your husband's wages are being spent on booze. It's no wonder these women became such fervent advocates for a dry nation. This confluence of social and political forces culminated in the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1920, ushering in the era known as Prohibition. It banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. It was a monumental attempt to legislate morality. But instead of creating a more virtuous society, it backfired spectacularly. Prohibition didn't stop people from drinking, it just drove it underground. A massive black market emerged, controlled by gangsters like Al Capone, who were more than happy to supply the thirsty masses. They built vast criminal empires, controlling everything from production and distribution to corrupting politicians and law enforcement officials. Think about the irony here. Those who championed prohibition for moral reasons ended up fueling the rise of organized crime and widespread immorality. And, get this, even seemingly untouchable figures like the Kennedy family were entangled in this web of illicit activities. The Kennedy patriarch, the one who would build a political dynasty, amassed his wealth through bootlegging. This just goes to show how deeply ingrained the illegal alcohol trade became in American society. Prohibition had inadvertently created a system where even the most powerful families were profiting from breaking the law. And speaking of profiting from breaking the law, let's talk about Al Capone, the poster child for Prohibition-era gangsters. His ruthless control over the Chicago outfit showcased just how dangerous and powerful these criminal organizations had become. One event that stands out as a chilling example of this era's violence is the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. While never definitively linked to Capone, the image of 7 men gunned down in cold blood in a Chicago warehouse sent shockwaves through the nation. But the violence wasn't limited to gang warfare. Prohibition also led to a surge in deaths from poorly made bootleg liquor. People were literally dying from drinking poisonous alcohol. It's a grim reminder of the unintended consequences of trying to control people's behavior. And let's not forget the hypocrisy that ran rampant during this time. Take President Warren G. Harding, a vocal advocate for prohibition, championing piety and good morals. Yet behind closed doors, he was embroiled in extramarital affairs and scandals. This stark contrast between his public persona and his private life highlights the futility of trying to force moral righteousness through legislation. What's even more fascinating is how prohibition impacted America's relationship with its neighbors. While the U.S. was struggling with its dry experiment, countries like Canada saw their liquor industries boom as they legally supplied booze to American bootleggers. One nation's moral crusade became another nation's economic windfall. As we've seen, the consequences of prohibition were far-reaching and often unexpected. It's a story filled with irony, hypocrisy, and the unintended consequences of trying to control human behavior. Now let's delve deeper into the cultural shifts that occurred during this turbulent period. Remember those dries who were so sure prohibition would lead to a sober and morally upright nation? Well, they got a harsh reality check. The demand for alcohol didn't disappear, it just went underground. And who stepped in to meet that demand? You guessed it, gangsters like Al Capone. Suddenly these criminals weren't just petty thugs, they were savvy businessmen catering to a huge market. They controlled entire supply chains from production to distribution, and they even had law enforcement and politicians on their payroll. It's a classic case of unintended consequences trying to eliminate a behavior only made it more profitable and dangerous. But here's where it gets really interesting. These gangsters, these purveyors of illegal booze, actually became folk heroes to some. Think about it, the government's telling you what you can and can't drink, and here are these guys flouting the law, living lavishly, and thumbing their noses at authority. It's easy to see why they captured the public imagination. And this spirit of rebellion wasn't confined to the criminal underworld. Ordinary Americans found ways to get around the ban, whether it was brewing their own bathtub gin at home or sneaking off to speakeasies, those hidden bars that became symbols of resistance against prohibition. These speakeasies weren't just places to get a drink, they were social hubs, often with live music, and an air of excitement that came from knowing you were doing something forbidden. There's a certain allure to the forbidden, wouldn't you say? But let's not forget the dark side of this era. The quality of homemade liquor was often terrible, leading to cases of alcohol poisoning and even death. Gang violence spilled into the streets, and the corruption that permeated law enforcement eroded public trust. The consequences of prohibition were far-reaching, and eventually Americans had enough. The movement for repeal gained momentum, fueled by the disastrous outcomes of this social experiment. And in 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified, bringing an end to prohibition. Prohibition may be over, but its legacy continues to shape America's relationship with alcohol. We still grapple with the questions it raised about individual freedom, the role of government, and the complex interplay of morality and the law. Now, you might think that once Prohibition ended in 1933 with that 21st Amendment, everything went back to normal, but that's not quite the case. America's relationship with alcohol had been fundamentally altered, and some of those changes are still with us today. One of the most significant impacts was the consolidation of the alcohol industry. Before Prohibition, there were countless small-scale breweries and distilleries, but many of them couldn't survive the dry years, unable to compete with the well-funded and well-connected bootleggers. When Prohibition ended, it was the large-scale producers, those who weathered the storm, that emerged as the dominant players. In a way, the craft brewing and distilling renaissance we see today is a reaction against this consolidation, a return to the diversity that was lost. Another legacy of Prohibition is this intricate web of laws that govern how we consume alcohol even today. Think about it: drinking age limits, liquor licenses, restrictions on advertising. Much of this can be traced back to the post-Prohibition era. It's a strange paradox, isn't it? This grand experiment in social engineering ultimately failed to curb drinking, but it left an indelible mark on how we manage and regulate alcohol consumption. It shows that even failed experiments can have a profound and lasting impact on our lives. But perhaps the most interesting legacy of Prohibition is how it continues to capture our imaginations. Those images of flapper dresses, hidden speakeasies, and gangsters with Tommy guns, they still hold a powerful allure. We've romanticized and mythologized this era in countless books, movies, and TV shows. Maybe it's the thrill of the forbidden, the idea of a society rebelling against authority, embracing a culture of defiance and indulgence. Or maybe it's a longing for a time when things seem simpler, the lines between right and wrong clearer, the stakes higher. Of course, as we've seen, the reality of Prohibition was far more complex and nuanced than those romanticized portrayals. But that doesn't diminish the power of the stories, the enduring fascination with this turbulent chapter in American history. So what are the enduring lessons we can learn from this grand experiment? First and foremost, it reminds us that human nature is a powerful force, and attempts to control it, however well-intentioned, often backfire. Trying to legislate morality, whether it's alcohol or any other behavior, often leads to unintended consequences. It can empower criminals, erode public trust, and create a culture of defiance rather than compliance. Prohibition also underscores the importance of individual liberty. The American spirit thrives on independence and self-reliance, and people will find ways to exercise their freedoms even in the face of government overreach. And perhaps most importantly, the story of Prohibition cautions us to be skeptical of simple solutions to complex problems. History teaches us that easy answers are often illusions, and those who promise them might have their own agendas, not the common good at heart. So the next time you raise a glass, remember the legacy of Prohibition. Remember the unintended consequences, the hypocrisy, and the ultimate triumph of common sense over misguided idealism. Remember that building a better society requires more than good intentions. It demands careful consideration, open debate, and a willingness to learn from the mistakes of the past. And as we face the challenges of our own time, let's carry those lessons forward. Let's approach complex issues with humility, recognizing that easy answers are rare, and the journey toward a more just and equitable society is ongoing. That brings us to the end of our deep dive into the paradoxical world of Prohibition. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep those minds engaged. Until next time on Stories of History.